This is the story of how one man's blueprint built the American dream, and how that same blueprint quietly decided who was allowed to dream it. Chapter 1. An America that rented. Before you can understand what William Levitt built, you have to understand what he was building against. In 1940, fewer than half of all American households owned the homes they lived in, 43.6% to be precise. More than half the country rented. Not because they preferred it, not because homeownership was considered an unreasonable aspiration, but because the financial architecture of homeownership in America was designed in ways that made it nearly impossible for working families to clear the bar. Mortgages, when you could get one at all, typically ran 5 to 10 years. At the end of that short term, you didn't simply finish paying. You owed the remaining balance, often most of the purchase price, in a single lump sum called a balloon payment. Miss it, and the bank took the house. Down payment requirements were steep. Credit standards were unpredictable. Banks considered home lending risky, and after the catastrophic lending environment of the late 1920s, they had only grown more cautious. The Great Depression made things considerably worse. Between 1929 and the late 1930s, residential construction had collapsed. Developers who had borrowed to build went bankrupt. Banks tightened further. Millions of American families who might have eventually bought a home instead postponed that dream indefinitely if they allowed themselves to hold it at all. The federal government had made one significant move in 1934, establishing the Federal Housing Administration, which introduced longer mortgage terms and lower down payments for qualifying buyers. That was a genuine improvement for many working-class families, but the FHA came with a shadow attached to it. Its own underwriting manual, the document that guided which neighborhoods received favorable ratings for federally backed mortgages, explicitly warned appraisers against insuring mortgages in areas with racial diversity. The language was bureaucratic, almost clinical. The effect was to systematically deny federally backed financing to neighborhoods where black families lived. The Homeowners Loan Corporation reinforced this by producing color-coded security maps for 239 American cities. Green for safe investment, blue for stable, yellow for uncertain, red for areas deemed too risky for institutional lending. The red zones almost always corresponded to black neighborhoods. This practice would come to be known as redlining, a term that described not just a color on a map, but an entire architecture of financial exclusion that would shape American life for generations. This wasn't an accident. It was policy, and it was firmly in place before William Levitt broke a single blade of sod. Then the war came. And it didn't just freeze the housing market. It compressed 4 years of unmet demand into a single explosive moment, the day 16 million Americans came home at once. Chapter 2. 16 million men come home. World War II ended in August 1945. And within months, a demographic wave crashed into American society with a force that no planner had fully anticipated. Nearly 16 million Americans had served during the war. Most of them were young. Many had married before they shipped out, or shortly after they returned, and virtually all of them wanted the same things: a job, a family, a home. The timing could not have been worse. For 4 years, civilian construction had essentially stopped. Lumber was rationed. Steel was directed to military production. Concrete, copper wiring, plumbing fixtures, all of it had been prioritized for the war effort. The American construction industry had not merely slowed, it had been suspended entirely. Meanwhile, the population had kept moving. Factories drawing wartime labor had swelled cities far beyond their housing capacity. Families doubled up in apartments never designed to hold them. Couples lived with parents. Children shared bedrooms. Entire extended families squeezed into spaces meant for a couple. Veterans who had fought across Europe and the Pacific returned to find they had nowhere to live. Some moved into spare rooms at their parents' houses, men who had led platoons and survived combat now sleeping in their childhood bedrooms. Others rented cramped apartments shared with 2 or 3 other families. Some lived in converted chicken coops, refitted railroad cars, or surplus military barracks that cities were scrambling to repurpose as emergency housing. The housing shortage was not a statistical abstraction. It was a daily humiliation for millions of men who had been promised that what awaited them at home was worth the sacrifice. Newspapers described scenes of veterans standing in lines for hours to view a single available apartment, only to be turned away. One city official compared the situation to trying to fill a bathtub with the drain wide open. America needed a solution, not a gradual one, an immediate one. And the traditional construction industry, skilled crews working house by house, one at a time, through months of labor, was mathematically incapable of meeting the scale of demand. The country needed millions of homes. It needed them quickly. And nobody in the established housing industry had any idea how to provide them. The answer didn't come from architects. It didn't come from Washington. It came from a college dropout from Brooklyn who had spent the war building military housing under impossible deadlines and who kept asking one question nobody else was asking. What if houses were built the same way Detroit built cars? Chapter 3. The Man Who Thought Like a Factory. William Jared Levitt was born in Brooklyn in 1907. He attended New York University and left without graduating, a fact he never seemed troubled by, because by then he had already decided that the education worth having was the one happening in his father's business. Abraham Levitt had founded Levitt & Sons in the 1920s as a conventional real estate development company. Abraham was meticulous about aesthetics, landscaping, curb appeal, the visual impression a neighborhood made on the people who lived in it. His son William was interested in something entirely different: speed, cost, systems, the hidden machinery beneath the finished product. When the government came to Levitt & Sons in 1941 with a contract to build 2,350 housing units for defense workers in Norfolk, Virginia, William didn't approach it as a construction project. He approached it as a logistics problem. The Navy needed housing fast. The budget was fixed. Deviation wasn't an option. He came out of Norfolk with lessons that most traditional builders never thought to learn. What he had discovered was that traditional home construction was astonishingly inefficient. Under the conventional model, a skilled crew was assigned to a house and stayed with it from foundation to finish. One team, one house. Weeks of work before moving to the next site. Every crew had to know every trade. Every project required constant mental adjustment as conditions changed from house to house. Levitt started rethinking the entire sequence from the ground up. Henry Ford hadn't invented the automobile. What Ford invented was a method for producing automobiles that made them affordable for ordinary Americans. The moving assembly line worked because it eliminated the one thing that made skilled craftsmen expensive: versatility. A craftsman who can do everything costs more than a specialist who does one thing perfectly. And a specialist who does one thing perfectly, repeated across thousands of units, becomes faster and more reliable than any generalist who has to think his way through each new situation. Levitt borrowed that logic and applied it to residential construction. He broke the process down into 27 discrete steps. Each step was assigned to a dedicated crew that did nothing else, ever. One group poured concrete slabs. Another erected wall frames. Another installed roofing. Electricians followed in sequence. Then plumbers. Then floor installers. Cabinet crews. Window teams. Painters. Landscapers. Each crew moved through a row of houses, performing its single specialized task on each one before advancing to the next row. No crew waited on another. The entire choreography was planned days in advance. Materials were pre-positioned exactly where they would be needed. Lumber arrived pre-cut to specification. Levitt had purchased his own timberland in California and operated his own sawmill, ensuring consistent dimensions and eliminating delays from outside suppliers. Nails came in pre-counted bundles. Paint arrived in precise quantities calculated for each specific interior. Nothing was left to individual judgment that could be standardized in advance. Waste was eliminated, not by disciplining workers, but by redesigning the system so waste had no opportunity to occur. To competitors who heard about the method, it sounded either ingenious or impossible. To William Levitt, it looked inevitable. The only question was whether he could find a site large enough to prove it. He found it on Long Island, and what happened there would become the most famous construction story in American history. Chapter 4. The Potato Field Becomes a City. The Island Trees section of Hempstead, Nassau County, was not glamorous land. It was flat, largely treeless, and dominated by potato farming, the kind of landscape that highway drivers passed through without slowing down. It was also perfectly positioned, 30 miles from Midtown Manhattan, served by the highway infrastructure that had been threading across Long Island since the 1930s. Flat enough for large-scale construction, without expensive grading. Inexpensive enough, even at the premium Levitt paid for it, that the economics worked if he built at sufficient volume. Levitt and Sons broke ground in 1947. What followed was unlike anything American construction had ever produced. At peak production, Levitt's crews were completing between 30 and 35 houses every single day, not starting them, finishing them roof, floors, walls, plumbing, electrical, kitchen appliances, and a newly seeded front lawn, and moving families in. The operation required military-scale logistics. Trucks arrived and departed on precise schedules. Foremen carried clipboards with production targets broken down by hour, not by day. Visitors to the site described it as disorienting. It didn't look like a construction site. It looked like watching a city materialize in fast motion. The scale of the operation is difficult to fully absorb. Every morning, identical stacks of pre-cut lumber appeared at precisely the correct position along the street for the framing crew that would arrive within the hour. Every afternoon, a different crew moved through those same frames, laying electrical wiring according to a standardized plan that never varied from house to house. The plumber who arrived on Thursday morning had run the same pipe configuration so many times he no longer needed to think about it. The painter who followed on Friday applied the same interior colors at the same intervals with a speed that observers compared to watching a machine rather than a craftsman. Levitt later estimated that the specialized crews had reduced the actual labor time per individual task to fractions of what a conventional contractor would require. A worker who spends every working day of his life doing one thing becomes faster at that thing than anyone who approaches it fresh each time. Multiply those efficiencies across 27 separate steps, and the savings compounded into something that traditional builders simply could not compete with on price. By the time the last house was complete in 1951, 17,447 homes stood where potato fields had been 4 years earlier. The community had 9 swimming pools, 7 village greens, 2 bowling alleys, a town hall, multiple shopping centers, and its own newspaper, the Levittown Eagle, distributed to keep residents informed and invested in their new community. Its population was approximately 82,000 people. That made it larger than the city of Binghamton, New York, larger than Reno, Nevada, larger than hundreds of American municipalities that had taken generations to reach the same size. Levittown had done it in 4 years. Chapter 5. Selling the Dream. William Levitt understood something most developers overlooked. People weren't shopping for houses. They were shopping for a life. Every advertisement Levitt produced emphasized not the dimensions of the rooms, but the quality of the experience inside them. Fresh air, children with space to run, a neighborhood where families knew each other's names, the quiet satisfaction of a place that was genuinely, legally yours, where the walls you repainted were your walls, and the lawn you mowed was your lawn, and nobody could raise your rent or tell you to leave. To make that pitch credible, the price had to be within reach. The original Cape Cod model sold for $7,990. No down payment required for veterans. monthly payments of roughly $60 less than many families were already paying in rent for apartments they would never own. In today's money, that's approximately $100,000 for a house. For a returning veteran with a GI Bill mortgage guarantee, it felt close to a financial miracle. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, had created the engine that made all of this possible. By guaranteeing veterans' mortgages, the federal government dramatically reduced the risk that banks faced in lending. Long-term, fixed-rate mortgages became accessible, down payments dropped or disappeared entirely. The balloon payment that had haunted a previous generation's homeownership dreams was replaced by a 30-year schedule any family with a steady income could plan around. The first Levittown homes were modest, around 750 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, simple finishes, no basement in most cases, no elaborate architectural details. But to families who had spent years sharing apartments with relatives, sleeping in living rooms, and waiting for housing that never seemed to arrive, these homes felt like something entirely different from anything they had experienced before. They had a yard, a driveway, a front door that was theirs. Levitt was careful to include details that went beyond the bare structure. Abraham Levitt personally supervised the landscaping, insisting on 2 fruit trees and a garden plot for every home. He also required that buyers mow their lawns weekly during the first year. This wasn't aesthetic preference, but strategic neighborhood management, ensuring that the visual impression of Levittown remained consistent enough to protect property values across the entire development. The community pools were not an afterthought. Levitt built them specifically so residents would spend their summers in the neighborhood rather than driving back to city beaches. In 1949, when he introduced the larger ranch model at $9,500, he included something almost no developer had ever offered: a built-in television set. A family with a television stayed home in the evenings. Staying home meant investing emotionally in the suburb. The television was an anchor as much as an appliance. Prospective buyers arrived in numbers that overwhelmed the sales offices. Traffic jams formed on Long Island roads as families drove out simply to see what everyone was talking about. Some lined up before sunrise to secure a position in the queue. Newspapers described the scene as resembling a department store sale, except that what people were waiting to buy was a future. Within months of opening, Levittown had a waiting list. Every family that moved in received a key, a deed, and the physical sensation of having arrived somewhere permanent at last. What they did not receive was a clear explanation of one line buried in the contract. A line that answered a question nobody in those cheerful sales offices was asking out loud, and that would quietly define who this neighborhood was actually for. Chapter 6. Clause 25. And the Myers family. Levittown's original lease agreements contained what was identified as Clause 25. In plain language, it stated that no dwelling could be used or occupied by members of other than the Caucasian race. Those words were not unusual in 1947. That, in itself, is the indictment. Racially restrictive covenants had been embedded in real estate contracts across the United States for decades. They appeared in deed restrictions in California, in Chicago neighborhood associations, in exclusive developments outside Boston, in the legal paperwork of suburbs from coast to coast. They were written in careful legal language, reviewed by attorneys, signed by the same notaries as every other clause in the contract. They were, in the most literal sense, standard practice in American real estate. The federal government had helped make them so. The FHA's own underwriting manual had explicitly discouraged lending in racially integrated areas, recommending that developers use deed restrictions to prevent future racial change in new subdivisions. In other words, the agency whose mortgage guarantees made Levittown financially possible was simultaneously instructing developers to keep black families out. William Levitt understood this architecture perfectly. In a 1954 interview with the Saturday Evening Post, he was asked directly about the racial exclusion policies in his developments. He said he could solve a housing problem, or he could try to solve a racial problem, but that he could not combine the two. He argued that if he integrated his developments, the FHA would withhold financing, white buyers would go elsewhere, and the business model would collapse. There was partial truth in that. The FHA did threaten to withdraw mortgage guarantees from integrated developments. The business risk was real. But historians who have studied the record note that Levitt had political influence other developers lacked. He had been celebrated by presidents. He had the ear of federal officials. He chose, consistently, not to use that influence to challenge a system he had significant capacity to push back against. The result was not ambiguous. Hundreds of thousands of black veterans had served in the same war. They had the same GI Bill benefits, the same incomes, the same desperate need for affordable housing, the same legal standing as citizens. Of the first 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill in New York and New Jersey alone, fewer than 100 went to non-white veterans. Fewer than 100 out of 67,000. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer that state courts could no longer legally enforce racially restrictive covenants. Many assumed the problem had been largely solved. It had barely been touched, because the system had other instruments that required no contract language at all. Exclusion didn't require a court. It required only a salesperson who could claim no homes were available, a loan officer who could find a technicality to deny financing, a developer who simply never showed a black family a listing. These mechanisms left no legal record and required no documentation to operate effectively. The 1,960 United States Census captured their cumulative result in a single figure. Levittown, New York. Population approximately 82,000. Black residents, effectively 0. 12 years after the first families moved in. 12 years in one of the most diverse metropolitan regions in the world. Nowhere did the collision between the American dream and its hidden cost become more visible than in Levittown, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1957. William Myers Jr. was a World War II veteran, a gas station owner, a refrigeration engineer, and the father of 3 young children. He and his wife Daisy were, by every conventional measure, exactly the kind of family the suburbs had been built to serve. In August 1957, they legally purchased a home at 43 Deep Green Lane in Levittown, Pennsylvania, not from Levitt directly, but from a white family who sold to them through a chain of transactions designed to make the purchase possible. They became the first black family to live in that Levittown. What followed was not a quiet adjustment to a new neighborhood. Within days, crowds began assembling outside their home. At the peak, estimates placed the number at 500 people gathering nightly on the street, some simply watching, others shouting threats. The family next door hung a Confederate flag in their window, positioned to face directly into the Myers living room. A rock came through the window. Pennsylvania State Police were deployed. The national press arrived. For 8 weeks, William and Daisy Myers lived under siege in a house they had legally purchased in a neighborhood built on the premise that ownership was available to any American family that could meet the financial requirements. They stayed. The Myers story was not an anomaly. Similar confrontations played out across post-war suburbs in Chicago, Detroit, and throughout the urban North. Wherever black families legally entered neighborhoods, the system had been designed to keep white. But Levittown had a particular symbolic weight. This was the most famous neighborhood in America, the one that politicians cited, developers copied, and television used as shorthand for middle-class aspiration. And the hostility the Myers family encountered exposed, without ambiguity, what the suburban ideal had actually been designed to protect. By the time the Fair Housing Act was signed in 1968, making racial discrimination in housing transactions formally illegal, the physical pattern had been in place for 20 years. You cannot unbuild a highway. You cannot reverse 2 decades of compounding wealth inequality. And you cannot redesign a suburb from the inside. Chapter 7. America copies the formula. By 1950, Developers across the country had studied what William Levitt had accomplished and drawn the obvious conclusion. The method worked. The market was enormous. The formula was replicable. Some visited Levittown in person. Others analyzed the aerial photographs that had circulated in every major newspaper in the country. Many simply copied the underlying logic. Buy large tracts of inexpensive land outside an established city. Design 2 or 3 standardized house models. Build the roads and community infrastructure before the residents arrive. Market the result as the ideal environment for raising a family. And repeat. What spread wasn't just a construction technique. It was a complete theory of how American life should be organized. By 1960, the United States homeownership rate had climbed to 61.9%, up from 43.6% in 1940. That 18-point jump represents the largest single-decade increase in American homeownership in history. It happened because the Levittown model, or variations of it, was being executed simultaneously across hundreds of markets. Suburbs were absorbing approximately 3 million new residents every year through the 1950s. Communities that had been quiet towns at the edge of cities became cities themselves. The suburban majority that feels obvious and natural today was, in historical terms, a remarkably recent invention. Popular culture and the housing industry reinforced each other in a feedback loop that proved nearly impossible to interrupt. Television, which reached approximately 90% of American homes by 1960, depicted suburban family life as the natural endpoint of American aspiration. The White House with the green lawn wasn't simply where people lived on these programs. It was what success looked like, what stability looked like, what a properly organized life looked like. But the racial architecture embedded in Levittown's original blueprint traveled with the formula wherever it went. The FHA continued discouraging integration in new suburban developments well into the 1950s. The federal highway system, authorized in 1956, made suburban commuting viable at distances that would previously have been impractical, and its routing decisions, in city after city, sent new roads through urban black neighborhoods that planners had designated as expendable rather than through established white communities that carried political protection. The suburb was pulling white families out of cities. The highway was cutting through the communities left behind. The FHA was simultaneously refusing to insure mortgages in the neighborhoods that remained. These systems did not require coordination to produce the same racially disparate outcome. They each followed their own internally consistent logic, and that logic, applied consistently and simultaneously across American cities, produced the racial geography that is still clearly visible today. The consequences for American cities were profound and lasting. As white families streamed toward new suburbs, the urban neighborhoods they left behind began a process of disinvestment that played out with grim consistency across the industrial North and Midwest. Businesses followed their customers to the suburbs. Tax bases contracted. Schools lost funding. Public services declined. The physical quality of urban housing deteriorated as landlords, unable to charge the rents that suburban homeownership made unnecessary, deferred maintenance, and eventually abandoned buildings entirely. Urban renewal programs, launched with genuine intentions to modernize deteriorating city neighborhoods, often accelerated the destruction. Between 1949 and 1973, federal urban renewal projects displaced an estimated 1 million Americans, the majority of them black residents of neighborhoods designated as slums, a term that covered conditions ranging from genuine blight to simply dense housing near downtown commercial districts that developers wanted to redevelop. Families displaced by these programs were moved into concentrated public housing towers rather than toward the suburban homeownership that white families were simultaneously accessing. The city was being rebuilt for the families who remained after the suburban migration, and the families who remained were disproportionately the ones who had been prevented from leaving. William Levitt sold Levitt & Sons to ITT Corporation in 1968 for $92 million, roughly $800 million in today's money. He then invested most of it in a French real estate venture that collapsed in the 1980s, leaving him in legal battles that consumed nearly everything he had earned. He died in 1994, nearly broke. The blueprint outlasted his fortune by decades, and it had already remade America. The most consequential thing Levitt left behind wasn't a building. It was a system, and that system had been quietly determining who could build wealth and who could not for 20 years before the law caught up with it. Chapter 8. The Blueprint and the Bill. It is worth pausing on the arithmetic, because the arithmetic tells a story that no amount of narrative can fully replace. A veteran who purchased a Cape Cod model in Levittown, New York in 1948 paid $7,990. By the early 2020s, comparable properties in Nassau County were selling for between $400,000 and $600,000. The nominal appreciation on that original investment ranged from 5,000 to 7,500% over roughly 75 years. But the final number is almost beside the point. What matters is what that equity funded along the way. It funded college tuitions in the 1960s and 1970s, when a 4-year degree was still within reach of a family that could write a check against the equity in their home. It funded small business startup capital, the restaurant, the dry cleaning shop, the small contracting company that home equity lines of credit made possible. It funded down payments on the next generation's homes, which appreciated in turn. It funded retirement. And it became inheritance, not spectacular wealth, but the kind of modest financial cushion that changes what options are available to the people who receive it. Home ownership at the scale Levittown enabled. It was not simply shelter. It was the primary wealth-building mechanism available to working-class Americans in the second half of the 20th century. The families who had access to that mechanism, at the moment it mattered most, built the foundation of the contemporary American middle class. The families who were excluded did not simply miss a deal. They were cut out of an appreciating asset class that their tax dollars had helped create, and that their military service had fully earned them the right to access by specific contract language, by deliberate federal policy, by informal practices that required no documentation to operate effectively. The gap that opened in 1947 did not stay the same size. It grew every year, and it grew fastest in the decades when the housing market appreciated most dramatically. The racial wealth gap in America, consistently one of the most persistent economic disparities in the developed world, was not created by the post-war suburban boom alone. But the suburban boom widened it at precisely the moment when the American economy was generating wealth most rapidly. Housing equity remains the single largest component of household wealth for most American families. The exclusion of black families from the post-war suburban market during the period of greatest appreciation is one of the most significant factors in that persistent gap. This is not a political argument. It is arithmetic. If you grew up in an American suburb, or if your parents did, there is a reasonable chance that the neighborhood you're picturing carries the DNA of what William Levitt built on Long Island in 1947. The lot sizes, the setbacks, the gently curving streets, the school positioned inside the residential area rather than at its edge, the assumption that a proper family home comes with a lawn and a driveway attached. These features feel natural because they are everywhere. But they were choices, specific choices made by specific people, codified into specific designs, and replicated so thoroughly that the original blueprint became indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Stand at the intersection of two residential streets in Levittown today, and you are standing in the same geometry that was surveyed onto potato fields in 1947. The street layout hasn't changed. The lot lines are the same. The underlying logic of the neighborhood, the way it relates to the roads, to the shopping areas, to the community facilities, is exactly what it was when the first families moved in. The trees have grown. The houses have been expanded, renovated, personalized. But the blueprint is there beneath all of it. as legible as ever if you know what you're looking at. William Levitt proved something genuinely remarkable. He demonstrated that the methods of industrial manufacturing could be applied to residential construction in ways that dramatically reduced cost and dramatically increased speed. In doing so, he helped solve one of the most pressing practical problems in American post-war history. The housing emergency of the late 1940s was real. The need was urgent. The traditional construction industry was structurally incapable of meeting it. Levitt's method helped provide homes for millions of families who had never imagined homeownership within reach. That is a genuine contribution to American life. It deserves acknowledgement precisely because the full story requires holding two things at once. The same blueprint that opened homeownership for millions was constructed, from its first day, to deny that opportunity to millions of others, not accidentally, not through oversight. Through specific language in specific contracts, through deliberate federal policy, through the quiet administration of systems presented as universal but operated selectively. The families excluded from that system didn't simply miss a favorable real estate market. They were prevented from participating in the primary wealth-building mechanism of their era, at the moment when that mechanism was generating the most wealth, by institutions that were funded in part by their own tax dollars, and by a war they had helped win. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other. And understanding both, holding them together without flinching from either, is what it means to look clearly at the neighborhood that built modern America. Drive through almost any suburb today. Notice the curving streets, the familiar rooftops, the lawns in various stages of Saturday attention, the driveways with their varying combinations of cars and basketball hoops and forgotten bicycles leaning against garage doors. It all seems so ordinary. It seems that way because someone made it ordinary. Someone looked at a potato field and saw a blueprint. And America has been living inside that blueprint ever since.